The chamber of the Galactic Council filled with representatives from 1,000 worlds, and each one looked more concerned than the last, as Elder Vaxthorn stepped forward to address the assembly with data streaming across holographic displays showing Earth and its violent history of wars and conflicts. The humans had just made contact 3 months ago, and already the Council had gathered enough evidence to recommend immediate quarantine of the Sol system. But the Jakar Dominion representative laughed at the suggestion and called it the paranoia of dying empires afraid of fresh blood in the galaxy. Commander Lauren Hayes stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, watching stars streak past as her ship moved deeper into uncharted space than any human vessel had ever gone before, and she felt both excited and nervous about what they might find out here. In the darkness between known worlds, the crew had been traveling for 6 weeks when their sensors picked up a strange signal coming from an ancient station floating in a nebula that their star charts said should not exist, and Lauren knew protocol demanded they report it and wait for orders, but something about the signal felt urgent and desperate. She made the decision to investigate and ordered her pilot to change course toward the derelict structure that looked older than any civilization currently known to the galactic community, and as they approached the station, seemed to pulse with a faint blue light that their instruments could not properly analyze or explain. The away team suited up, and Lauren led them through the airlock into corridors that had not seen visitors in thousands of years, with walls covered in symbols and writing that predated even the oldest council records and made their universal translators malfunction with error messages. They found her in a chamber at the station's heart, standing perfectly still in a cryogenic pod that should have failed millennia ago, but somehow still functioned and kept its occupant preserved in suspended animation, and beside her rested an egg made of crystal that pulsed with inner fire. The woman had silver hair that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness and pointed ears that marked her as something other than human. And when the pod opened, her eyes snapped open, revealing silver irises that seemed to see through them and into their very souls. She spoke in a language their translators should not understand, but somehow the words made sense in their minds like memory rather than sound, and her first sentence made Lauren feel cold with fear, as she said the devourers were coming and they always came when civilizations grew too bright. Lauren tried to ask who she was and where she came from, but before the woman could answer, the entire station shook violently, and alarms began screaming warnings about incoming ships and weapons charging outside in the nebula surrounding them. The Jakar fleet had followed them and now surrounded the ancient station with warships bristling with plasma cannons, and their commander broadcast a message demanding Lauren surrender the station and its contents as salvage in Jakar territory or face immediate destruction. Lauren refused to abandon someone who needed help and ordered her crew to prepare for emergency evacuation with the mysterious woman and her crystal egg, and the moment she gave the order, the Jakar opened fire with bright lances of energy that tore through the ancient station's outer hull. The woman moved faster than any human could and grabbed the egg while running toward the Vanguard with Lauren and her team, and behind them the station began to explode as systems that had survived 10,000 years finally failed under the assault of modern weapons. They barely made it back to the ship before the station detonated in a massive explosion that sent shockwaves through the nebula, and Lauren ordered maximum speed back toward Earth while Jakar ships pursued them, firing constantly at their engines and life support systems. The woman sat quietly in the medical bay, holding the crystal egg close to her chest. And when Dr. Maya Winters tried to examine her, the woman simply said her name was Elindra, and she was the last of her kind, and the egg was her only remaining family. Lauren managed to outmaneuver the Jakar fleet using tricks and tactics that no honor-bound alien commander would ever consider legitimate warfare, and they escaped into human space with Elindra and the egg safe, but trailing a dozen angry Jakar warships behind them. When they reached Earth, the Jakar commander broadcast a message to the entire galactic community, accusing humanity of piracy and theft and demanding immediate return of artifacts stolen from Dominion territory, with threats of war if Earth refused to comply. The Galactic Council tried to mediate, but the Jakar had already committed to their course and mobilized their full war fleet toward Earth with support from several opportunistic empires who saw a chance to claim humanity's resources and strategic position. Lauren brought Elindra to meet with Earth leadership and tried to explain what had happened, but all anyone could focus on was the incoming threat and the impossible choice between surrendering someone who asked for help or fighting a war against superior numbers and technology. Elindra watched the humans prepare for battle and saw something in their determination that reminded her of her own people before the fall, and she held the crystal egg closer, knowing that what came next would determine the fate of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. The egg began to crack with thin lines spreading across its surface and a faint glow building from within, and Elindra whispered that it was time for Ignathar to wake after sleeping for 5,000 years and meet the species that would either save or doom them all. The egg split open in Dr. Maya Winter's laboratory, filling the room with light that seemed to come from stars themselves, and what emerged made every scientist present question everything they thought they knew about biology and physics. Ignathar looked like a dragon from human myths, but made of living fire and shadow with scales that shifted between solid matter and pure energy, and eyes that held intelligence far beyond any animal and matched the depth of awareness in Elindra's gaze. The bond between Elindra and the dragon was immediate and profound, as Ignathar moved to her side and curled around her protectively while making sounds that were part roar and part song, and Elindra placed her hand on the creature's head, with tears streaming down her face. Maya tried to understand what she was seeing and asked Elindra to explain what Ignathar was and where they both came from, but the answers only raised more questions about ancient wars and extinct civilizations and threats that lurked between dimensions. Elindra began to share fragments of her history, telling them about the Ethelsari, who had ruled a vast empire when current galactic powers were still primitive, and how her people had fought something called the Consuming Swarm for 10,000 years before finally falling. The swarm was not just an enemy, but a force of nature that existed partly outside normal space, and fed on civilizations at their peak, consuming entire species and absorbing their knowledge and biological traits to become stronger with each victory. Her people had created weapons and strategies to fight back and had even wounded the swarm badly enough to drive it into hibernation, but the cost had been total extinction, with Elindra surviving only because her mentor had sealed her away, hoping future generations might finish what they started. While Elindra spoke, the Jakar fleet arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system and broadcast final demands for surrender, with a deadline of 6 hours, before they would begin orbital bombardment of human colonies and military installations. Captain Claire Morrison commanded Liberty Station, the largest orbital defense platform humanity had ever built, and she watched the enemy fleet assemble with cold calculation, knowing they were outnumbered 5-1, but refusing to show fear to her crew. The Jakar expected humanity to either surrender or meet them in traditional fleet combat, with organized battle lines and formal challenges. But Claire had studied every human war from ancient times to the present, and knew that desperation bred innovation. When the deadline passed and the Jakar moved forward, expecting Earth forces to form defensive positions, Claire instead ordered her ships to scatter and use guerrilla tactics, hitting supply lines and isolated ships before vanishing into asteroid fields and debris clouds. The Jakar commanders were confused and angry at what they saw as cowardly fighting, and they broadcast messages calling humans dishonorable and demanding they face their enemies properly. But Claire just smiled and ordered another ambush on their fuel tankers. Meanwhile, Elindra watched the battles unfold on tactical displays and felt a growing sense of horror because she recognized the patterns in how humans fought, and they were identical to strategies her own people had developed over millennia of fighting the swarm. She tried to explain to Lieutenant Kate Brennan that humanity had attracted attention they did not want, and that by fighting so creatively and effectively, they had created psychic ripples that would wake things better. Left sleeping in the dark between stars? Kate asked what she meant, but Elindra could only point to Ignathar, who had become increasingly agitated and was staring at empty space as if seeing something no one else could detect, and the dragon began to growl low and threatening at invisible enemies. Amy Rodriguez worked in engineering trying to understand the technology Elindra had brought from her people's time and discovered it operated on principles that merged biology with machines in ways that made the distinction between life and technology meaningless. The ancient devices could do impossible things like generate power from quantum fluctuations and create shields that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, but they all required something human technology lacked, which was a willingness to blur the line between organic and artificial intelligence. Elindra explained that her people had crossed that line out of desperation when fighting the swarm, and it had given them power but also marked them as a threat to the natural order and possibly attracted the swarm's attention in the first place. While humanity celebrated victories against the Jakar fleet, the Galactic Council sent Ambassador Thalara to negotiate a ceasefire and prevent the war from spreading, but she arrived too late to stop what happened next. A rift opened in space above a Jakar colony world, and things that should not exist poured through the gap, moving with horrible purpose toward the planet below, and within hours, all communication from 3 Jakar worlds went silent. The last transmission from the colony showed creatures that looked like nightmares, given flesh with body parts from a dozen different species, merged together in ways that defied nature, and eyes that held only hunger and the need to consume. Elindra watched the transmission and knew immediately what had come, and she felt ancient grief and terror rise in her chest because the consuming swarm had awakened and it had found them far sooner than she had feared possible. Through her bond with Ignathar, she experienced a vision of possible futures, and in every timeline she saw the swarm growing stronger, feeding on world after world until nothing remained but emptiness and silence across the entire galaxy. The vision showed her why the swarm had awakened now after sleeping for so long, and the answer terrified her, because it was humanity's fault, not through malice, but through their very existence as billions of creative minds resonating with psychic energy. Earth was not just another world to the swarm, but a feast unlike any it had encountered in millennia, and humanity had rung the dinner bell by expanding so rapidly and fighting so cleverly that their presence burned bright enough to be seen from between dimensions. Elindra realized that by rescuing her, Lauren had not just saved one person, but had accelerated a timeline that would determine whether organic life survived in this galaxy or whether the swarm would consume everything and everyone before moving on to fresh hunting grounds. The Jakar Dominion sent a desperate message to Earth, asking for help against the swarm and offering to end hostilities immediately if humanity would share their knowledge of fighting unconventional enemies, and Lauren faced a choice that would define her species. Future military commanders argued they should let the Jakar face the consequences of their arrogance and use the time to fortify Earth defenses. But Lauren remembered Elindra's warnings that every species consumed made the swarm stronger and harder to defeat. She convinced Earth leadership to accept the alliance, and within days, human ships were fighting alongside their former enemies against creatures that violated every natural law and seemed to grow more dangerous with each world they devoured. Elindra served as advisor to the combined fleet, teaching them strategies her people had learned through blood and sacrifice. But she was haunted by visions from Ignathar showing timelines where they failed, and the swarm consumed everything living. The dragon had grown rapidly in just weeks and now measured 20 meters from nose to tail, with the ability to phase through solid matter and breathe plasma that burned even in the vacuum of space. And most terrifying was its ability to sense the swarm across dimensions. Dr. Maya Winters worked day and night with Elindra to unlock secrets of ancient technology and discovered that the Ethelsari had built a weapon called the Sundering Array, designed to seal dimensional rifts and cut off the swarm's reinforcements. The weapon had never been completed because the Ethelsari fell before they could gather all necessary components, and the designs were scattered across a dozen worlds that now lay deep in territory. Controlled by the swarm captain, Claire Morrison, volunteered to lead strike teams to recover the components, knowing it was essentially a suicide mission, but understanding that buying time was the only way to let humanity do what it did best, which was adapt and innovate. Each mission cost lives as ships ventured into swarm-infested space, dodging creatures that had once been members of extinct civilizations, but were now twisted into monsters serving a hive mind that existed partially outside reality. They recovered components one by one, and each artifact brought them closer to completing the Sundering Array, but also revealed how desperate the Ethelsari had been in their final days when they built weapons that required terrible sacrifices. Lieutenant Kate Brennan analyzed swarm attack patterns and discovered something disturbing because the creatures were not just consuming randomly, but searching methodically for something specific, and all vectors pointed toward Earth. Further analysis revealed the swarm was hunting for Elindra and Ignathar, because they represented the last living connection to the Ethelsari, and killing them would accomplish something the swarm desperately wanted. Elindra finally shared the complete truth with Kate, explaining that her people had not actually lost the war against the swarm, but had chosen mass sacrifice to become a living seal, binding the dimensional gates and preventing the swarm from entering this reality permanently. She had survived because her mentor needed someone to serve as the key to maintaining the seal, and if Elindra died, the final lock would break and the swarm would flood into normal space with its full strength. Instead of just these advanced scouts, the swarm knew this and had been trying to kill her for thousands of years while she slept in cryogenic suspension, protected by technology designed to hide her presence. But humanity's awakening of her had created ripples the swarm could detect. Kate realized they were facing an impossible situation because keeping Elindra alive was essential to preventing total catastrophe. But her very existence attracted the swarm like a beacon, and there seemed to be no way to win Amy Rodriguez, and her engineering teams worked to assemble the Sundering Array on Earth's moon, using recovered components and knowledge from Elindra's people, but encountered a critical problem with the weapon's power requirements. The array needed energy beyond what any reactor or star could provide, and instead required something organic with a soul-deep connection to both normal space and the dimensional barriers between realities, which meant either Elindra or Ignathar would have to sacrifice themselves. Elindra accepted this fate calmly, having known for thousands of years that she existed only to buy time for others, and she began preparing herself mentally for what would come when the array was complete. But Ignathar refused to accept her sacrifice, and through their bond showed Elindra visions of futures where she survived and helped rebuild what the swarm destroyed and found peace after millennia of war. The dragon communicated that there was another way, and that Ignathar's sacrifice would be just as effective as Elindra's, because their souls were linked and the connection would persist even after death in a form that could power the array. Elindra tried to refuse and argued that Ignathar had just been born and deserved to live, but the dragon was adamant and showed her that this was the path to the best possible future, even if it meant they would be separated. The swarm launched its largest assault yet, throwing everything it had at Earth because it sensed the Sundering Array nearing completion and knew that if the weapon activated its invasion would fail. Thousands of swarm creatures entered the solar system, overwhelming defensive lines and pushing toward Earth with single-minded determination to destroy the array before it could be used against them. Lauren commanded the defense fleet using every trick humanity had learned in its short time among the stars, but the swarm adapted quickly, learning from each engagement and becoming harder to fight. Claire held Liberty Station even as swarm creatures boarded the platform, and her crew fought hand-to-hand against nightmares made flesh-buying precious minutes for the array to reach full operational status. The galaxy watched as Earth faced extinction, and species that had ignored the Council's warnings about humanity now saw what made humans dangerous, which was not their violence, but their refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds. The Jakar fleet formed defensive positions around Earth alongside human ships and vessels from a dozen other species who had finally recognized that if humanity fell, the swarm would consume them next. Commander Lauren Hayes coordinated the combined forces using human tactical flexibility merged with alien technology and created strategies that no single species could have developed alone. Elindra stood with Ignithar on the lunar surface beside the nearly complete sundering array, and she felt ancient sorrow mixing with pride as she watched the galaxy finally unite against a common threat, just as her people had dreamed. The dragon had grown to massive size with wings that could wrap around small buildings and power that made reality bend in its presence. But what struck Elindra most was the love she felt through their bond. Dr. Maya Winters ran final calculations on the array and confirmed what everyone feared, which was that the weapon would work, but required a living soul as its core, and there was no way around the sacrifice Ignithar moved to the center of the array before anyone could stop the dragon. And Elindra felt her heart break as she realized what was about to happen and tried to run forward, but Maya held her back. Through their bond, Elindra experienced what Ignithar was thinking and feeling, and understood that the dragon had made peace with this choice, and saw it not as ending, but as transformation into something new. The swarm creatures reached the moon and began their final assault on the array, with thousands of twisted bodies throwing themselves at the defensive lines in waves that seemed endless. Captain Claire Morrison led the ground defense with soldiers from a dozen species fighting side by side against nightmares, and she knew they could not hold forever, but they only needed to buy enough time. Amy Rodriguez made final adjustments to the array, while explosions shook the lunar surface around her, and she worked with hands that trembled, knowing that one mistake would doom everyone. Lieutenant Kate Brennan coordinated intelligence from across the solar system, tracking swarm movements and trying to predict where the next wave would strike so defenders could shift to meet them. The swarm seemed to sense what was coming and intensified its attacks, with new creature types appearing that combined abilities from every species it had ever consumed, creating monsters that seemed unstoppable. Human ships rammed swarm vessels when their weapons ran dry, and crews set their reactors to overload, creating explosions that cleared paths through enemy formations. Jakar warriors fought with renewed purpose, having seen their worlds consumed and knowing that honor meant nothing if there was no one left alive to remember it. Elindra broke free from Maya and ran toward Ignithar, reaching the center of the array and embracing the dragon one final time while tears streamed down her face. She begged Ignithar not to do this, and offered to take the dragon's place. But Ignithar showed her a final vision through their bond of a future where Elindra lived and found happiness. The vision showed her teaching new generations about the mistakes her people made and helping them avoid the same fate and finding purpose in preservation rather than war. Ignithar communicated that this was the dragon's purpose, and that their bond would not truly end but transform into something that transcended physical existence. The swarm creatures broke through the final defensive line and charged toward the array with only seconds remaining before they would destroy it and doom the galaxy. Lauren gave the order to activate the array even though final checks were incomplete, and Amy threw the switch, knowing they were out of time. Ignathar roared with a sound that shook the moon and merged with the sundering array, becoming a pillar of fire and light that reached toward the stars. Elindra felt the bond stretch and change but not break, and she experienced Ignathar's transformation into something that was part machine and part living energy and part pure consciousness. The array activated with power that made dimensional barriers visible as sheets of reality that had been torn, and the weapon began repairing the damage with fire that burned away, swarm corruption. Across the galaxy, dimensional rifts sealed, cutting off the swarm from its reinforcements, and for the first time in the invasion, the creatures seemed confused and uncertain. The swarm creatures already in normal space began fighting with increased desperation, knowing they were cut off from the hive mind beyond the dimensional barriers. Lauren pressed the advantage, ordering all ships to target the largest swarm concentrations, and using the moment of confusion to inflict maximum damage. Claire watched as swarm creatures on the lunar surface stopped coordinating and began acting independently, making them easier to defeat, even as they became more unpredictable. The Galactic Council broadcast a message praising Earth's stand and offering full support to finish the war, but the fighting was far from over. Thousands of swarm creatures remained scattered across the galaxy, and without reinforcements they would fight even harder. Knowing extinction was their only alternative, Elindra stood at the array's center, feeling Ignathar's presence surrounding her like warmth, and she understood that the dragon had not truly died, but transformed into a guardian. The echo of their bond remained strong enough for her to sense Ignathar's thoughts and feel reassurance that the sacrifice had been worth it. But the war continued, and the galaxy would need to hunt down every remaining swarm creature before they could rebuild and adapt to existence without dimensional reinforcements. The coalition forces pressed their advantage hunting swarm concentrations across the galaxy, and for the first time since the invasion began, the creatures were losing ground. Commander Lauren Hayes led strike forces against swarm strongholds using tactics that combined human creativity with alien technology, and each victory weakened the enemy further. Elindra served as advisor, but spent much of her time at the sundering array, maintaining the connection with Ignathar and ensuring the dimensional seals remained strong. Dr. Maya Winters studied the effect the array had on the swarm and discovered something remarkable, which was that cutting off their dimensional connection had severed the hive mind's ability to share knowledge between individual creatures. This meant each swarm creature was now fighting with only its own intelligence, instead of drawing on the collective experience of the entire species, and they became far less effective. Captain Claire Morrison tracked down the largest remaining swarm concentration and found it hiding in a nebula trying to rebuild its numbers by consuming asteroids and space debris. The creature had grown massive by absorbing everything it could find, and had become a node attempting to recreate the hive-mind connection, but its efforts were failing without access to dimensional energy. Earth developed a new weapon based on Ethel-Sari technology that Amy Rodriguez called the Dimensional Cannon, and it was designed to target the connection between the swarm's physical form and its existence in other dimensions. Claire volunteered to test the weapon against the massive node creature, knowing it was risky, but understanding that they needed something capable of destroying swarm concentrations quickly. The dimensional cannon fired and reality rippled around the target as the weapon tore apart the bonds holding the creature's multidimensional existence together. The effect was catastrophic for the swarm, as the node creature collapsed into itself and began consuming its own mass in a feedback loop that could not be stopped. Across the galaxy, other swarm creatures felt the node's destruction and began exhibiting signs of panic as they realized their species faced true extinction. Lieutenant Kate Brennan coordinated the final hunts, tracking down isolated swarm creatures and ensuring none escaped to rebuild in forgotten corners of the galaxy. The Galactic Council formally apologized to Earth for not taking humanity's warnings seriously and granted them a permanent seat among the great powers. Ambassador Thalara proposed that Earth lead the new Galactic Defense Initiative designed to prevent future existential threats and ensure species work together rather than competing. Alindra watched as humanity took its place among the stars and felt hope for the first time in millennia because she saw in them the best qualities of her own people without the arrogance that had led to the Ethelsara's fall. Maya approached Alindra with a discovery that changed everything because buried in the swarm's remains were fragments of Ethelsari consciousness preserved in the dimensional barriers they had become. The fragments were not complete individuals, but contained memories and personality echoes that might be restored with time and effort and technology. Humanity was now developing. Alindra felt tears streaming down her face as she realized her people were not completely lost, and that given centuries or millennia they might be brought back in some form. But she also understood that any restoration would create beings who were not quite the same as the originals, and the galaxy would need to decide if that was ethical. Kate discovered coordinates in data recovered from the ancient station where they had found Alindra, and the location pointed to a system far beyond known space. Analysis suggested the coordinates marked the position of more dragon eggs hidden away before the Ethelsari fell, and possibly other survivors in cryogenic suspension. Lauren offered to take Alindra there, using a human exploration vessel equipped with technology from a dozen species and capable of traveling farther than any ship before it. Alindra accepted, knowing her journey was just beginning and that the galaxy needed wisdom from the past. To avoid repeating ancient mistakes, Amy helped design the ship and included a special chamber where the sundering array could maintain its connection with Alindra, even across vast distances. Claire insisted on leading the escort fleet that would protect the exploration vessel and ensure Alindra reached her destination safely. The day before departure, Alindra stood beside the sundering array and felt Ignathar's presence stronger than it had been since the transformation. Through their bond, she understood that parts of the dragon existed in the array maintaining the seals, but other parts had scattered into the fabric of reality itself. Ignathar showed her that their connection transcended death and distance, and that no matter where she traveled, they would remain linked. The vision filled Alindra with peace, and she finally accepted that loss could transform into something beautiful if you had the courage to move forward. The exploration vessel launched with Alindra aboard, heading toward coordinates that promised either answers or more questions about her people's fate. She watched Earth shrink behind them and felt gratitude toward humanity for giving her hope when she had thought herself alone forever. The ship's hull bore a symbol that Maya had designed, showing a dragon made of living flame and words in both human language and ancient Ethelsari script. The words said never forgotten and never alone, and Alindra knew they applied not just to Ignathar, but to every species that had fallen to the swarm. The Galactic Council had been right to warn others about humanity, but not because humans were dangerous in the way they feared. Humanity was dangerous because they represented hope in a galaxy that had forgotten how to fight for itself, and hope was the most powerful force in existence. As the ship entered hyperspace, Alindra allowed herself to dream of finding other survivors and bringing her people back from the edge of extinction. She knew the road would be long and difficult, but for the first time in 5,000 years, she was not walking it alone. Ignathar remained with her in ways that transcended physical form, and humanity had proven themselves worthy allies in the eternal struggle against forces that sought to consume all life. The galaxy had survived its brush with extinction, and in doing so had learned that unity and creativity mattered more than individual power. Elindra smiled as she looked toward unknown stars and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The story of the Ethelsari was not over, and the story of humanity had only just begun, and together they would write new chapters. Somewhere in the dimensional fabric surrounding reality, Ignathar stirred and sent warmth through the bond they shared. The dragon was not gone but transformed into a guardian, watching over the galaxy and ensuring the swarm would never return. And Elindra knew that as long as that connection remained, she would never truly be alone in the vast darkness between stars.